I just want to acknowledge that this bill will not go anywhere near addressing what is required for youth offending, and our concern is that it will only do more harm. So kia ora.
But you'll have 5 minutes with us this morning. You may use that time however you wish. If you'd like us to ask some questions, please make sure that you leave some space. Ready when you are.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Philippa tōku ingoa. I'm a psychologist and behaviour analyst working with children and youth with learning disabilities and developmental disabilities, as well as neurodiverse conditions. I specialise in behaviour psychology, which is the science of how individuals learn and behave, and much of my work focuses on instigating behaviour change and teaching new skills to replace problematic behaviour. So despite what the ACT Party would tell us, military-style boot camps are not based in behavioural evidence. Boot camps are based on the flawed belief that punishment and discipline alone can change behaviour, and this simply isn't true. Behavioural science tells us that effective and lasting change involves reinforcement-based strategies, teaching new skills, and environmental change. Research consistently shows that boot camps do not reduce reoffending rates and have no lasting positive impact. They ignore the root causes of offending, and they further harm the very individuals that they claim to help. They remove young people from their environment, but then they return them to the exact same conditions that led to their behaviour, even though we know that lasting change requires addressing environmental factors, not temporary discipline. The fact that they rely on aversive control, such as punishment and fear, rather than teaching skills or reinforcing pro-social behaviour or making meaningful changes to an environment, is really harmful. So we know that they do nothing to address poverty or systemic racism, differing support needs, or trauma, which is what most of our youth in tamariki, what causes people to offend. The science and research of behaviour and learning shows us that punitive environments often lead to increased aggression, avoidance behaviours where offending continues, but you just focus on not getting caught, and psychological distress and trauma where there is already a lot of that in a young person's life. Furthermore, neurodivergent and disabled individuals are massively disproportionately represented in the justice system. So according to our Department of Corrections, we have about 49% of our prison population are dyslexic, despite less than 10% of the general population. A meta-analysis of research into prison systems showed that up to 30% of prisoners have ADHD, despite only 3% of the general population. And compared to prisoners without ADHD, prisoners with become involved in the criminal justice system at a much younger age and have higher rates of recidivism into adulthood. There's also a massive overrepresentation in a lot of other disabilities and cognitive impairment, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, autism, communication disorders. So neurodivergent and disabled youth have very unique learning and support needs, and we know that punitive approaches absolutely do not address these. So instead of relying on ineffective punitive approaches, we need to be investing in evidence-based solutions. Truly evidence-based practice has to be robust and well-researched and involve experts in behaviour change and psychology. So to give you an idea of snapshot of what this might look like, I work with several children who've been excluded or disengaged from school. They're often isolated from their communities. One such child who is autistic and has pervasive demand avoidance had been aggressing towards teachers and peers alike. Within a couple of months of careful and consistent work with a therapist, he'd been slowly building rapport with adults and allowing us to gradually reintroduce more requests and demands through therapeutic play, step back into a school at a rate that he's comfortable with, and expand his tolerance to the world around him. So he still has a way to go, but we can see hope for him now that he can potentially thrive in a school system that isn't built for him. If he didn't have that privilege to access the individualised therapy he's gaining right now, then in 5 years' time, he might be exactly the type of young person who would qualify for these military-style boot camps. And a person such as this, in this situation, would surely internalise the label serious youth offender. The sudden and extreme authority and structure would make demands become even more aversive for him, and he'd be in such a high level of constant mental distress that would cause him further trauma, alienation, and almost certainly result in a lifetime of offending. So really, while it's tempting to go with more simplistic solutions, the more complex solutions are needed for these complex problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. I'm just going to ask you a quick question. So,
Sure.
part of the program is to actually have a proper upfront assessment for this neurodiversity because, like you say, it is so prevalent. And where the military style academy is not appropriate, these youth would not be actually involved. Do you think it needs to be explicitly stated within the legislation that that assessment needs to be required?
I mean, I think that if this were to go ahead, then yes, it would absolutely need to be explicitly stated. But on top of that, we can see that the things that work for our neurodivergent rangatahi and tamariki tends to be effective for neurotypical children as well. That if you think of a lot of these neurodivergent youth, such as the canary in the coal mine almost in terms of like our education system, we find that when there are supports in place for those children, then other children also benefit from that. So while, yes, I've talked about neurodivergent youth and how this would be absolutely a really, really problematic and traumatic experience for them, I do believe that that is the case for our neurotypical youth as well. Maybe not to as much of an extreme, but certainly, and given that it is such a large overrepresentation in our justice system, that really needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have with you.
Laura, given we're ahead on time and a whole lot of submitters haven't submitted, can we ask our question?
I think we might be back on schedule currently, but let me just check with the clerk. Is there time, Jaden?
Up to you, Madam Chair.
Okay, if it's a real quick question, I'll let you ask
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
Maria Menel's got a question too. She's had her hand up from the beginning. But can I just, my question is to you as a psychologist. We've talked a lot about the evidence base for why this doesn't work and the psychological impacts on the young people and why that's negative. I'm going to ask you a bit of a tricky question. What is the psychology of people who continue to ignore the evidence that is put in front of them and want these types of initiatives to be run for our young people, even though it's damaging?
Yeah, really good question. So I think that a big part of that is the kind of immediate kind of reward that a lot of these people get from maybe the knee-jerk support from people around them, or maybe just being able to say in that moment that, look, I solved this, I ticked this box. I know that there are a lot of people who are thinking about this, who do sincerely want the best for our tamariki, and I would urge them to please really consider this evidence and really think about how that is going to affect our youth. I know that especially in the kind of having the peers of your party around you, it can be really, really hard to cross the floor. So there are a lot of different factors in there.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it there because I don't want to get behind time. But
No
you'll have
worries.
5 minutes with us. There's a wee timer that you might be able to see. If you want us to ask questions, just leave some time within that.
Thank you.
you.
Ko Deb Fraser Kormani Takawinga, Kaitiaki Whakaata Tohu Tohu Mara Services and co-chair of the National Committee for Addiction Treatment. Just want to mihi to you all. Achieving the balance for youth offending of accountability, responsibility, reparation and when necessary containment are all areas that need to be carefully considered in youth offending decisions. This needs weighed up in regard to the context of offending and the circumstances that have shaped where our taiohi are at. Undoing the damage of the past, changing intolerable and unacceptable behaviour, changing patterns of a lifetime takes a concerted and comprehensive response. We have a whakatauhi. Humankind owes the child the best that it can give, and we are not. We need to do better for all children and young people, especially those who end up in a cycle of offending in the revolving door of the youth justice system, and for some young people, prison. I know you're wanting to find solutions, however, quick fixes and long-term problems are only temporary. Solutions are in the whānau and in community. 85% of young people in one of our services, our Youth Addiction Day program, which is a kaupapa Māori program with a kaupapa Māori framework, and includes outdoor and therapy-based components of the program, are all under youth justice. The rest are all engaged in some level of offending. 100% have acted violently in some way or had violence perpetrated against them, and have a number of risks to self and others. They all present with coexisting problems, whether that be mental health or behavioural, and of course neurodiversity. Using Western and tikanga Māori approaches with a range of positive outcomes in all measures, with standardised outcome measures. So we're seeing, of course, that through being able to pre-entry and post-entry, we see some significant changes throughout all areas that are measured through the outcomes. We just had Oranga Tamariki cut funding to the service, losing our whānau role. The key work in the mahi, and it is now solely Te Whatu Ora funded. It runs on 10% of what it costs to run the current military or boot camps, providing a range of therapeutic approaches and following young people pre and post being involved in the program. Addiction treatment centres, especially residential programs, are full of people who have experienced trauma through family harm and other events, neglect, sexual assault, not as adults but as children. Children who have grown up with more than usual events that have shaped their lives, so adverse childhood events that have shaped their lives through the usual trials and tribulations of adolescence, and as said, with their brains still developing and not the guidance or input that they needed. Many who were involved in corrective training or other types of models coming out with poorly done tattoos, teeth knocked out, and in some cases head injuries, and you think drug use is the issue. We have concerns about the rights of the child or the young person. One of our primary concerns is the impact of the rights of the child. As other submitters have noted, the bill does not inspire confidence that these rights will be adequately upheld. We're also concerned, of course, about the stigmatisation of young offenders. We see labelling of young people as serious youth offenders as very stigmatising, and this type of labelling can have long-lasting consequences on their future opportunities and self-image. There is insufficient consideration given to adolescent development in the bill. The fact is the adolescent brain is still developing, especially their frontal lobes. Parents are, of course, taking up the responsibility of frontal lobe, but then so does the system. I want to just refer to a case example. In fact, James is an example. At 14, he was living with his two sisters in a flat after the death of his grandparents, who were his caregivers. His parents were unable to care for him due to their mental health issues, addiction to methamphetamine, and trauma. Oranga Tamariki was involved, but James had minimal support. Despite concerns about his school engagement and social circle, he had little opportunity to change, and he started using drugs, began offending, and eventually became entrenched in the youth justice system. Ultimately, he was sentenced to a custodial term in Otago Corrections Facility after exhausting the youth justice options. Of late, James is seen by a youth addiction service which focused on stabilisation, harm reduction, reintegration, hana enhancing care. He has been homeless, hospitalised for self-inflicted injuries, and involved in family harm situations. But despite these challenges, he's resisted methamphetamine use. Even as his parents continue to use, James has started working in a conservation job and has made some positive strides, though he still faces struggles. I just want to acknowledge that this bill will not go anywhere near addressing what is required for youth offending, and our concern is that it will only do more harm. So kia ora.
Thank you, Deb, for your submission. We don't have any time for questions.
Kia ora. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm ex-Army, Eastern Army officer, late 1990s, early 2000s, and the headquarters I was working in, I had oversight on the Army's Youth Life Skills program. So that was things like our contributions to Spirit of Adventure, the limited service volunteers being run in Burnham, the inaugural services academies that were started in Christchurch. One of the big lessons we learnt from that work was people thought the army was all about what you see in the movies, lots of shouting, stamping of boots. A lot of people say, oh, that's discipline, that does good things. It doesn't. It works for the army in a very, very special environment with people who've already been through a lot of selection to get there. When we started working with these at-risk youth in Christchurch, it was apparent from day one that they had already been shouted at, and they'd had all of that. They didn't want or need that, and it just doesn't work. The guy we had running it was a very, very smart guy, very, very good trainer, and he identified the way ahead was to do absolutely the opposite to that, to start treating these young kids like people, to find out what's happening at the home environment. Is there a home environment? And that's what we based the whole program on, was the bigger holistic picture. What's going on around these kids? What are the real issues? How can we start to just gently engage and sort of shape that ahead? And the things that kept coming through, the driving catalysts for kids going off the rails, becoming at risk, are poverty, and that causes anger and frustration. And a lot of the time, all they're doing is lashing out. I mean, we've all been at one stage a young teenager and been really angry regardless of their backgrounds. It doesn't take much of a nudge to all of a sudden find yourself on the wrong side of the law. I'm just so against these boot camps. They're a movie fabrication. If you watch lots of movies and that's your reality, they sound like a really good idea. They just don't work. There's no evidence to support them. There's a lot of evidence that does support. If you can engage the poverty, stop the anger, stop the frustration, you can start making real changes. And that's where later on I went to work in elements like counterinsurgency, and the same messages again: stop the poverty, stop the anger, stop the frustration. And how do you do that? You do that by creating jobs. You do that by making sure that infrastructure is running. There's clean water, there's power, the sewage isn't running down the streets. Once you start to do that, you give them education, then you're opening a bit of a tunnel, putting a bit of a light in. And to me, more and more, everything that came out of what we learned was it's all about prevention. Once you get to the stage of considering boot camps, you're into the cure. And some of these kids aren't curable, I don't think. I know someone will disagree, but I think a lot of, if you can get in early, get into prevention, you can just stop this happening, and you never have to talk about doing boot camps. If you go down the boot camp path, as the other speakers before me have said, it's going to fail. It's only going to make things worse. So let's not do that. Let's look at the causes. Let's fix the causes, so we never have to do this boot camp thing. It just won't work. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Carmel, you had your hand up first.
I'll go quick so Maria Mino can get her question in too. I guess it's a bit of a surprise position, really, because you're talking about having run these before. I expected you to go down the track and talk up the merit. One of the difference, though, I think, from what you ran and what we're seeing here is I think they were largely volunteer. Like LSV is certainly, it's not a punitive thing. It's something that people have the option of going into. So there is a bit of a difference there.
But I think that's the critical part of it. If you force someone into doing something, they're not going to want to do it. I mean, it's almost like a Kiwi stereotype. The more you force the horse to drink, the more it doesn't want to. There's always got to be a selection process. They've got to want to be there. You can't force them to. And that's why I say sometimes you have to accept you can't save everybody.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to say was you talked about the causes and prevention being more important than having a cure, even though I do believe that some of these kids, they are not, we can't write them off. But the causes, what needs to happen there. And then answer quickly so Maria Mino can get her question in before she gets cut off.
Quick, easy thing. In this current New Zealand, stop putting people out of work.
Yeah.
Unemployment creates problems.
Thank you very much.
Real quickly, Matamino.
Oh, just actually, Carmel you had my thinking in hand, but just to you, Simon, your angle and your expertise and your credentials, I do hope that gets understood better in this forum. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Simon. Thank you.
Kia ora tato, ko Anis Delmage Toku Inua. I just need to make it clear that the following views are mine and don't necessarily represent those of Te Whatu Ora. I've no affiliations or declarations of interest. I'm simply a psychiatrist who works with children who are in trouble with the law, and I've done so as a consultant for the last 15 years or so. Unsurprisingly, I've got a number of concerns with this bill, but I wanted to spend my time today discussing labelling theory, which is a way of describing how young people acquire a sense of themselves as they move through their adolescence. Now, this identity can have a major impact in terms of later life choices, and specifically, I wanted to talk about labelling theory in relation to the young serious offender category, which of course is the gateway into the military-style academies. So I have 3 points to make today. The first is that the way that we describe our children has a markedly deterministic effect on what they subsequently become. There's a whole raft of research backing this up, some of which is in my written submission. Now, of course, one of the tasks of adolescence is acquiring a sense of ourselves, and we know that rates of recidivism increase with even low-level contact with the police and the courts, and this makes perfect sense to me as a psychiatrist who works with children, because most don't have a good sense of what they're good at, and within child psychiatry there's a mantra that children have to be good at one thing. These children aren't accepted at school, so they're often kicked out, they don't have an identity there. The well-behaved children's parents don't want them playing with the well-behaved children, so they don't have a sense there. They're often kicked out of home. Mum's trying to manage 5 other children. Father's disappeared. So they get booted out into the street and they start to try and work out what they're good at. And at the end of the street, it's a little gang that says, okay, little Steve, maybe what you're good at is taking drugs across town or stealing from a shop or what have you. And suddenly that becomes their sense of value. The second point I've got to make is that the YSO category is pretty hard to get off of. Most of the rangatahi that I work with, to ask them to be completely offence-free for a 2-year period is ridiculously ambitious for them, and we need to reset our expectations, I think. The third point I'll make is, as you can tell from my accent, I'm from the UK, and the UK tried out many years ago a thing called the Antisocial Behaviour Order, which was a category for children at risk of serious offending. And it was an absolute disaster and became a badge of honour, in fact, for many children who aspired to achieve ASBO status. And there were a whole raft of memes out there if you want to Google them. So instead, what I would propose is help, not harm, which, by the way, is actually a lot better for taxpayers in the long run. So instead of finding more ways to remove children from their home area and to take them away from whānau, we need to find better ways to support them locally. We need to work to dissolve our dependence on big institutions where abuses are not just likely but inevitable. And we need to start spending our taxpayers' money in an evidence-based way, by which I mean earlier in their lives. In summary, then, my view is that we need to change the way we're looking at youth crime and start spending money in a smart way if we're genuinely interested in combating it. And that starts with avoiding labels like the YSO category, which in my view is unhelpful and counterproductive as a description of a bunch of kids who high needs across many areas. You've heard from other contributors today: health, mental, physical, welfare, education, protection, and crucially their sense of belonging or what we call citizenship. No, I don't pretend this is a quick solution, but it is an effective one. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate you've got a lot of people to hear from, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you for your submission. We have a question from Maria Mino.
Thank you. Ines Tēnā koe. The justification to this kind of bill is that it's not going to be the same as the other times. So and we've got this thing called wraparound, and we're going to sprinkle a bit of culture in there just for the hell of it. And so when too many of them will be brown and Māori like me, and in the context of your expertise, tell me how you think about that.
Oh, look, I work in an inpatient, a secure inpatient unit. About 2/3 of our admissions are Maori. About 1/6 are Pacifica and Maori. So we encounter the same in youth justice residences, of course, and the care and protection residences, might I add. So very high rates of very poor Maori and Pacific Island rangatahi and tamariki. So I'm all for wraparound care. I'm all for multi-agency working. I think that's very sensible. But the label which we're imposing in doing this, I think, is a very unhelpful, counterproductive one.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your submission and your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, members, we'll be moving on to our final submission for this morning's session. We have Ben Matthews with us. Kia ora, Ben. You'll have 5 minutes with the committee. There is a wee timer that you should see up on your screen. Feel free to take however long with that 5 minutes. However, if you do want us to ask you some questions, please make sure that you do leave some time allocated within the 5 minutes. You're free to start.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Nō reira, kei te māreikura o te kōhanga reo, ko ka iritana, kei te pītau whakarei o te whānau ora, whaia tari ana, kei aku kuia o te pō, moi mai rā, moi mai rā, moi mai rā. Come to you today, firstly and foremost, as a descendant of te wharetapu o Ngāpuhi Ngāti Hine Tauranga Moana, Ngāti Parau, but also as a whāngai of Wairarapa. I'm a father of 3 tamariki Māori, aged 8, 5 and 11 months. I'm a community leader, tiriti rights activist, a church leader, and I've worked closely with rangatahi and tamariki Māori in all of these settings. My master's thesis explored the application of rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga in the modern contemporary context, and I'm here to firmly oppose the Oranga Tamariki Amendment Bill for 4 reasons. Firstly, the bill disproportionately targets and impacts on rangatahi Māori. The fact that Māori will make up the bulk of young serious offenders, and the fact that the police are disproportionately more heavy-handed toward rangatahi Māori will not bode well for rangatahi Māori rehabilitation and well-being. Not too long ago here in Wairarapa, we had police officers randomly photographing rangatahi Māori on the streets without their consent, highlighting my earlier point. Independent police report found that being Māori increased the likelihood of prosecution by 11% compared to European New Zealanders when all other variables remained constant. The report also found that structural racism within the police were part of the reason Māori men were likely to be stopped and tasered. I believe that police brutality combined with this bill would only further entrench these challenges. Secondly, Māori have not been consulted on the development of this bill, despite legislation guidelines requiring that Māori be consulted on kaupapa, where they are likely to be disproportionately affected. Thirdly, the bill also lacks evidential backing and is based on personal views and political ideologies which are anti-Māori. The additional powers given to the courts and to the police attempt to deter crime by threatening more severe punishment, but there is no evidential backing for this. And it can actually lead to an increase in the risk and severity of future offending. Last but not least, the bill is a direct attack on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It directly conflicts with the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which guarantees Māori right to self-determination, protection of their taonga. Instead of empowering whānau, hapu and iwi, the bill reinforces a top-down approach where the state holds the balance of power, where Māori are subjugated under a system that doesn't reflect their values, ways of knowing, or methods of healing. And I remind the Select Committee that my tupuna, Te Ruki Kawiti, the great chieftain of Ngāti Hine, never ceded his sovereignty in signing Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which means that Māori are their own sovereign and are on equal footing and partnership with the Crown. And so any solution in this space must be whānau-centred, mokopuna-oriented, kaupapa Māori aligned and mātauranga Māori informed. I offer 3 recommendations. Firstly, it is clear that Māori have lost faith in oranga tamariki, and this has been clear inquiry after inquiry and report after report. So I recommend an overhaul of the current mainstream prevention, intervention and care system so that they can better reflect the needs of tamariki Māori and their whānau. Secondly, I recommend that Oranga Tamariki incorporate a Māori worldview into its operations, systems, and policies. This includes a recognition by the government that whakapapa whenua and whanaungatanga are vital in meeting the social, cultural, spiritual, and health needs and well-being of tamariki Māori. And lastly, I advocate for authentic and meaningful engagement and relationships between Māori and Oranga Tamariki that leads to Māori having constructive involvement in the care of their tamariki. Finally, this bill represents a significant injustice that has the high likelihood of leading to another generation of tamariki Māori being abused and traumatized at the hand of the state. I urge the Select Committee to abandon the bill and adopt a more constructive and tiriti-centric relationship with Māori that is mokopuna-oriented, whānau-led, kaupapa Māori aligned, and mātauranga Māori informed. Ka tia haui konei.
Thank you so much for your submission. We've gone over time, so we don't have any time for questions, but I appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us. Thanks. Okay, members, that takes us to the end of our morning session. We will resume at 1:30. And we will be hearing the Social Security Amendment Bill for those members that will be joining us.